Okay, Internet, here's part 2 of the URL shortener project I started last week. So I went ahead and I took that UI that I built out and I added a Firebase backend. This is my first time kind of tinkering with Firebase and it's totally awesome. So let's check it out. So for a little demo, here is the URL shortener in all of its glory. So if we enter any URL here and click shorten, it will give us this considerably shorter URL. And if we take that and we enter it into a browser, it will do a JavaScript redirect for us to our target URL. So there we go. Let's take a look at our data structure. So let me grab my Firebase endpoint, come back to the browser, and I'm going to actually use Vulkan for this, which is a new tool. Oops. It's pretty cool. So I've got this T.U.S.T.A.C.R, this URL shortener totally and completely rocks kind of namespace object that I have some security rules around. And then inside of that, I've got a key to URL and a URL to key. So key to URL maps an integer to the URL that we redirect to. And URL to key is obviously just the reverse of that. This is a denormalized database structure, so we had to do some special things to get around the fact that you can't actually query values in here. So obviously the integer maps to the value in this search string in the URL. So now that we see how the data is stored, let's check out the code. So main.js is just a really simple jQuery script that does some DOM manipulation stuff. I'm not too worried about the architecture in this program because it's so simple. So there really is no architecture at all. I've got this T.U.S.T.A.C.R object that takes in an endpoint, and all you have to do to get started with Firebase is call new Firebase with the endpoint, and that gives you a reference to your Firebase dataset. That's literally it. Really easy, very cool. So the first thing I do with that reference is I set up a kind of a watch callback on the first child of key to URL, and this will give me the most recently added key and URL pair. And so what I do with that is I take the key, the first key of that pair, parse it into an integer, which is the key that was inserted, and then I add 1 to get the next available key in the system. And this will get called anytime anyone in the world submits a new URL to the system while this client's page is open, which is really cool. So now what happens when you click shorten is that this get key from URL function is called with the URL we want to shorten. So the first thing I do is I check to see if the system has already shortened the URL, and I do that by looking in URL to key, and then I pass in the URL as the key. And then I get the value at that key, and basically I'm just seeing if that value exists, and if it does, that means that someone has shortened this URL already. So instead of making a duplicate, I just give the user back the key that was generated for that first shortening. If a value doesn't exist at that key, that means that the URL has not yet been shortened, so I call this add new URL function. And all this does is it comes down here and it starts a transactional update on key to URL, and the child of key to URL is the value of this.key, which is always, remember, the next available key in the system. So transaction takes 2 functions. It takes this transaction function that I define up here and the complete function, which I define right here. Transaction is really simple. Basically, I just see if there's data in that current block. If there is, I fail the transaction. If there's not, I put my URL in there. And then the onComplete function is also really simple. I just check for an error. If there's an error, I call my error callback. Then I check if the transaction completed successfully or not. And if it did, this function will add that reverse mapping using just a simple update. I don't do a transaction for that since I always want the reverse to be up to date with the straightforward mapping. And I call my success callback. If the transaction did not complete successfully, all I'm going to do is try this function again. So that may seem weird because I'm not actually incrementing the key, but remember that the key is incremented up in this listener. So if for some reason this transaction failed, that means that sometime in between saving this key value off and coming into this transaction function, another user somewhere must have submitted a URL to be shortened. So if that happens, I'm going to get the next available key up here. My transaction will fail. I'll come in here, call this function again, and then I'll take that new key value and try the transaction with that value. And that hopefully will succeed. If not, we can try the whole thing again. And that is about it. This whole thing is really simple. Like I said, this is my first time playing with Firebase, and it's really awesome. The whole no backend thing is pretty cool. I can see some limitations with that, but I really love the whole idea of implicit data pushes to the client. I can see that being really useful, and I'm planning on doing a lot of stuff with that in the future. So check out the URL shortener. This URL shortener totally and completely .rocks. You know, it's pretty cool. I think I positioned myself in a pretty strong place to disrupt the URL shortening industry. And be sure to follow my blog at onepixelsolidtomato.com and follow me here. Thanks, guys.